HDFC, HDFC Bank and IDFC Private Equity, Lewis spends his time with his wife connecting dots, using their networks to help organizations they are connected with. Lewis is actually associated with a number of nonprofits, and I can go on taking names. You could look up all the names on LinkedIn, but just to mention a few, he's on the board of Educate Girls and has co-founded Take Charge, a mentoring program for Catholic youth in Mumbai. On the corporate side, he's the chairman of Manipal Signa and a senior advisor at Morgan Stanley. He stays connected with the University of Chicago by being a member of the advisory board of the Rudd Stanley Center for Social Sector Innovation, a member of the Global Leaders Group at Chicago Booth, and a trustee of the University of Chicago Trust in India. And he also occasionally writes blogs for Forbes India, Thrive Global India, and Spontaneous Order. So that was my little introduction on Lewis. I would now move on to Shruti. Shruti is a senior research fellow at the Meraktis Center at George Mason University and a fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at NY University School of Law. Before joining the Meraktis Center, she was an associate professor of economics at State University of New York, Purchase College. She earned her PhD in economics from George Mason University. She has a BA Honors Economics and an LLB from University of Delhi and an LLM.
Okay, so there goes our first technical problem. I think I sort of...
I'll cut it short. Shruti's broad area of interest in the economic analysis of comparative legal and political systems. Her research interests specifically include law and economics, public choice theory, and constitutional economics. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals, law reviews, and books. She's also the host of the Ideas of India podcast. She enjoys writing in popular press and has a fortnightly column called The Impartial Spectator in Mint. She has also published opinion-related editorials on Indian political economy in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Real Clear Politics, Mint, the Hindu Business Line, and many more. So that's Shruti for all of you. Our third panelist is Himanshu Burad, an enthusiast governance affairs. Himanshu holds a post-graduation in public policy, design, and management from the Indian School of Public Policy with the Dean's List Award. He has a keen sense of determination to improve our governance system. Prior to joining ISC, he has interned to aid and assist the Union Health Ministry's COVID efforts. He has also worked with Global Policy Insights, a centrist policy think tank which actively engages and works to equip different levels of the government with domain knowledge, leading towards better policy decisions. Himanshu holds a Bachelor of Technology in Ceramic Engineering from IIT Varanasi. So that's our panelists for all of you. I tried to make it short, but they've just done so much that I couldn't make it short. So all over to you, Natasha.
Welcome. And thank you, Lewis and ISCE, for helping us put this together. Couldn't have done it without you all. I'm going to ask the audience to please keep posting your questions in the chat, and we will take them through the program as well as at the end. I'm going to start with you, Lewis. Let's set the context for today. And can you give me a one-line layman's description of what policy is to you? And then tell me what made you choose to set up a school focusing on policy?
Sure. So, so it's interesting when you look at what a policy is, what's regulation, what's law. So policies are rules made by an organization to achieve their goals and aims. So it's really you set the parameters for what you want to do, which is different from regulation, which are rules made to make people comply and behave in a certain manner. So when you look at what is public policy, it's a course of action created to or enacted typically by a government in response to public real world policies. Like, for example, now we have COVID going on in a pandemic. What are the policies that will be taken to control it and sort of make it, save the lives of people and get the economy back to shape? That's an example of what policy is. Now, why did I look at starting the Indian School of Public Policy? When Govind and I were sort of many eons back, going to business school and places like that, public policy wasn't something that was considered to be a viable sort of option to study. In fact, the Harris School at the University of Chicago started the year I started my MBA program in Chicago. But it was always something which I was interested in. After I quit full-time work, I was meeting up with a friend of mine who suggested that Ajay Shah, and he said, Louis, you got to meet Parth Shah. There are a lot of Shahs in this world. And I, met up with Parth, and he had started the Center for Civil Society in 1997. And one of the things we did at CCS was run CCS Academy, which is short-term public policy programs to help with train young people about what public policy is about. And we've been talking, do we run a larger program? And when we engaged with the alumni over the last, for around our 20th and 25th, towards our 25th anniversary coming up now, what are the things that they found most meaningful? It was the academy and the association with that. So we've been toying with the idea of setting up a full-time program, but our main question was, where are the jobs? And once we found that there was a viable way to set up jobs, we decided, Parth and I said, let's set up a public policy school. And that's what sort of triggered it off and set it up. I'll talk more later about why we think we've tried to create something unique and the lessons learned from that.
Okay. So, Shruti, I'm going to get the next question to you. You've done research, been a lecturer, an economist. What prompted you to write a paper on health policy on the Indian health sector?
Yeah, so the health economics is not my usual wheelhouse. So this is a good question. When we first got into the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion, if you remember, about flattening the curve, right? This is a fairly recent conversation in global health history, right? There have been epidemics and pandemics before. But the truth of the matter is that before this, we didn't have good scientific Western medicine to actually understand that, if you go to get a particular kind of treatment, you'll get a particular kind of result, right? So healthcare wasn't so systematic, even say 80 or 100 years ago, or during the Spanish flu, the previous huge pandemic that affected India. But now we have healthcare systems. Some of it is public and some of it is private. And most people's go-to solution when they get sick is the traditional, the healthcare system as we know it. Though some people do apply Eastern medicine and, their own, other kinds of treatments. So a fear during any pandemic is that we want to minimize the number of people who die, right? And the most interesting thing about pandemics is the more deadly they are, the shorter lived they are, in fact, right? Pandemics tend to be their worst when they are not so deadly and they are highly transmissible. So if you actually get a choice between a pandemic where it kills people very quickly versus it kills very few people, but it spreads very quickly, you want the one that doesn't spread that quickly, right? That's the kind of disease that you want. But the COVID pandemic, we realized actually the fatality rates are incredibly low, right? But the transmission rates are incredibly high. So what it can do is it can overwhelm the healthcare system, right? So this is the background I want to set up. So all this discussion that was taking place about flattening the curve, they said we need to have a lockdown. I was one of those people, said, we need to have all these measures to reduce transmission, right? That was the discussion that was going on in April and May last year, starting March last year. But simultaneously, how much the curve needs to be flattened, right? How much we need to reduce transmission such that the healthcare system can still cope and manage and people can still go on living our life depends on the capacity of the healthcare system. So we started out, my co-author and I, Abhishek Chattagunta, who is a PhD student at the University of Hamburg, we started out trying to understand exactly what the healthcare system is and how much we should flatten the curve. That was the purpose of the exercise. But when we got into the paper, we realized that we couldn't find a simple head count of healthcare capacity in India, right? It just hadn't been done. All the information was somewhere out there, but no one had done it. Academics don't get paid or don't get much credit when they do simple exercises, right? They need to write really complex papers that are original research and peer reviewed. So we didn't see any health economists engaging in this exercise. So we said, you know what? Everyone knows how to count, but economists know how to count really well, in the sense that we know when we are comparing apples to apples and when we are not comparing apples to apples, right? So that's one skill that economists have. So we said, let's bring the skill to the table and actually understand what the healthcare capacity is. And what we learned was devastating. We published this paper, I think, first week of April 2020. This is about 14 months ago. And India has one of the lowest, doctors per capita, lowest hospital beds per capita, and the list just goes on and on. The government spends very little on healthcare per capita, right? A fraction of what the developed countries spend, almost a 40th, in my home country of India versus what they spend in the United States here, which means that if it's the same virus that is going around infecting people, right, and it has roughly the same general characteristics, it's the same variant, then now you're in trouble, because the number of hospitals and hospital beds and ICUs and everything you have is very, very small. So that's the reason we did this. It's still relevant, unfortunately.
Thanks, Shruti. Himanshu, I can see all the audience questions coming in. So here, they are all having pretty much the same thought as the question I'm putting to you, saying, how did you land up in the COVID war room, straight from college to COVID war room?
Okay, so if you want to give me a short answer, I'd say with a little bit of luck and my sheer interest to serve in the pandemic in the country. So in a brief, IIC, the International Innovation Corps, which run a fellowship in the country, they came to ISPP. ISPP rolled out to the scholars, that is to us, and I applied, got selected and accepted the offer to work during the lockdown. But to elaborate it further, and I'll just take 2 minutes. So I'll just put things into perspective. So by 30th January, WHO had already declared SARS-CoV-2 as public health emergency of international concern. And in the March of 2020, we were kind of touring in the Jaisalmer, I think at Longewala border, all the ISPP scholars. Then around when we were back at our homes, and on 11th of March, I think WHO declared SARS-CoV-2 as a pandemic. Our holidays got extended, and on 18th of March, we got a mail from ISPP. I am quoting it exactly what the that title of mail was, that urgent opportunity to be part of COVID-19 task force. That's what the mail said. And it said that you have a lifelong opportunity to work in Ministry of Health during the COVID times. But I think the flip side is you'll have to put yourself at risk, because in the March of 2020, you can very well realize that nothing was known about COVID at that point in time. We were having, I think, news from Italy and the European nations regarding fatality rates being so high. So it was chaos, and I think it was, you can say, total chaos around the world at that time during with respect to COVID. And at that time, I found this opportunity. I think on 18th of March, I got this mail. I applied. On 20th of March, where I was interviewed by IC, and by evening, it was sorted that I am going to serve in Ministry of Health from the Monday morning. But the caveat was that on 19th and 20th of March, in my city of Bhilwara, which became the first hotspot in the India. So what happened was 2 doctors were having flu-like symptoms, and they didn't get tested for a week, and they checked a lot of patients. So my city went into lockdown on 19th of March. So I had to break the curfew and board the train, and then reach to Delhi on, I think, the eve of on the dawn of Janta curfew, 22nd March. And on 23rd of March, I was in Ministry of Health, helping the Ministry of Health officials with respect to COVID, different aspects of COVID. Initially, it was an internship, as I said. Then it got extended to another month, then another month, and then it extended for a full year. And that's what I'm doing for past 16 months now. So in a nutshell, that's how the journey been. And I think it is a very fascinating and extremely fulfilling journey for so far.
Thanks, Himanshu.
If I can just add one thing, Himanshu was probably the best student we had in his cohort. Himanshu, close your ears. You can't hear all this. And I was very keen that he actually follows us and does his PhD with us. And now, after I've heard all this, I'm kind of pretty happy that he stayed back to take on this important work. But I'm still going to hound him to come follow us at some point.
Definitely.
So Shruti, we will post your research paper for everyone to read, but simplify the jargon for us. I mean, fiscal federalism, centripetalism, let's leave all that aside. And can you just sort of put it in a nutshell? Give us an overview of policy in the Indian healthcare sector that you started with, but expand on that to tell us center or state and who is responsible for what.
Okay, I don't have a simple answer for center or state and who to point fingers at, but I'll try and give you a framework to think about it, right? The way India is structured, I'm sure many of you have heard this in your civics classes. India is a federal system with a unitary bias. This used to be the language when I was in 8th standard. I don't know what it is now, right? But it goes something like this. Now, it's not clear what that means because it's just not clear what that means, right? India is federal in the sense that it is set up as a federal nation. There are, units of power and a governance system at the union level, at the state level, at the local level, which is your Panchayati Raj or urban local body. But India's history has been such that it was right at the moment of birth crafted as a centralized system. So centripetal means all the energy goes towards the center, which is the union government, right? Centrifugal is it dissipates, right? So this is from our 8th standard physics lessons. So centripetal systems typically tend to concentrate all the power in the union government. That's what's happened in India. Now, there are various kinds of powers that the union government has. Now, the legislative lists in the 7th schedule of the Constitution, they place healthcare as a state subject, right? So both the center and the state can legislate on healthcare. Now, legislation is fine. The question is, it always comes down to where's the money, right? Who's going to spend on this? And it so happens that India is fiscally extremely centralized in the way it collects its revenue, in the way it distributes its revenue, and in the way it spends its revenue, which means no matter where the revenue is generated, most of that revenue actually goes to the union government. When I say goes to the union government, I don't mean physically, briefcases of cash are going. I just mean it belongs to the union government. And the union government, through the recommendations of the Finance Commission, will actually suggest how much should the state retain? How much will the union government retain? That's the first question it answers through its recommendations. The second is that different states get different allotments through a particular formula, which is based on need and poverty and so on and so forth, right? So this is how we divvy up the money in our country. So imagine a country now, imagine this is a family. Imagine it's a really large, like joint family system, okay? In a very large joint family system, say with, 10 or 12 siblings, let's say 28 siblings, just for instance, okay? And let's say there are lots and lots of grandkids. If the head of the family is incredibly switched on and has lots and lots of knowledge on the 28 children and the hundreds of potential grandchildren, right? Then the person who's the head of the family and in charge of the purse strings, you would imagine would do a reasonably good job with distributing the money. Okay, now leave that aside. Now imagine a typical Indian family where the head of the family is usually clueless, has no clue what the kids and the grandkids are doing, right? And is still in charge of all the purse strings, right? Doesn't have very good communication with different generations, doesn't get good feedback mechanism on what they really need. Would they rather get a new phone or do they need some really, important textbooks to study for IIT? It's unclear, right? What the kids really want. And this is the person who's in charge of distributing the money, right? What kind of system would you get? What kind of incentives do you have? Now, further, let's complicate this by saying that all 28 children of the patriarch are not equally likable, right? Has his or her favorites. Now they know that I like some kids more than others. So now what's that going to do to the family allocation? Right? In my family, which is two of us, me and my sister, my mom had a very simple rule. She said, one of you will cut the chocolate, the other one will choose. Okay. This was a highly incentive compatible system. So my mother trained us to be economists, right from when we were fighting over Cadbury's chocolate. But that's not the example I'm pointing at. Now imagine this at the union government and state government level. The union government has had all the money. The kids have never been trusted with money, right? They don't know how to balance their checkbook or balance their budget. They don't know if they get their money, should they spend it on a cell phone or should they spend it on getting their vaccines for their children? They've just simply never been trusted with money, right? So to simplify that, the way I would say that in jargon is states have never developed fiscal capacity, okay? States have not learned how to raise their own revenue, how to spend their own revenue without a massive, overwhelming presence of the union government. So that's part one, okay? Part two is the union government has not been the most benevolent and omniscient parent, right? Who instantly knows which grandkid needs the vaccine and which grandchild needs the phone, right? Anyone under 2 probably needs the vaccine. Anyone over 16 definitely needs the phone, right? And the head of the family has no clue that, who is 2, who is 16, what's going on with them. So the head of the family is also messing this up in terms of misallocation, right? Not understanding where this money should go. Now you combine these two problems and you basically get a hot mess, okay? And the hot mess looks like this. The capacity for healthcare is extremely underserved in this country, right? The government has systematically spent more in other areas like, roads, transportation, infrastructure, agricultural subsidy. I mean, you name it. The list is really long. We've spent more on fertilizer subsidy in many states than we spend on healthcare, right? So this is the situation from the union government side. The state governments now keep waiting. They say, we don't have much revenue raising authority. We are not being allowed to work. Typical Indian parent won't let the kids go out of the house, won't let them work, right? Won't do any of that. So we don't have permission to raise our own revenue. We don't have permission to get the money, right? We need to wait. Whatever little money we raise, we need to wait for the union government to tell us how to spend it, right? So now that's the second part of the problem. So what we saw when we saw the healthcare system is there are some states which have pretty good healthcare systems. There are some states where it's a terrible, terrible mess. I mean, if you just look at Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, whether it is doctors per capita, whether it's hospitals per capita, I mean, anything, pick any proxy for healthcare. And, their capacity is about 1/10 of Maharashtra or Andhra Pradesh, which are some of the richer states with better healthcare systems. So one, you get huge amounts of inequity. The second is the union government then said, we need to supplement the states with a lot of these programs, right? So we're going to have a midwife program, right? We're going to have a neonatal healthcare program. We're going to provide ventilators, right? All these different kinds of programs. Now, you can only have an Anganwadi or a midwife program if the hospitals are functional and they actually apply for the grants, right? So it just so happens the states that already spend a lot on healthcare actually get the most on healthcare from the union government. Okay, and the states which don't spend that much on healthcare because their systems are broken, like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, actually get less money from healthcare. So even that original system of there is inequity and, we need the union government to come and settle this problem now, even that is not working, right? All this is a result of centralization of money and revenue. That's what this is. That's where this is coming from. So we were trying to point that out in the paper and we looked at it and we said, you don't have equal healthcare systems. Now, going back to the first question that Natasha asked me, which is flattening the curve, right? Now, if Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh have dramatically different healthcare capacities, it means their curves also need to be flattened very differently, right? If your healthcare system is more functional, you can allow a little bit more activity. If your healthcare system is completely dysfunctional, then you can't allow any activity. You need to have an extremely stringent lockdown, right? So what the Indian government did instead was it imposed a centralized lockdown, one size fits all lockdown across the country, right? So whether it was a hotspot like, Himanshu's hometown in Rajasthan, right? Or it is, a place which has 0 cases like Sikkim. Sikkim had 0 cases when the lockdown was announced, right? Now, both places get the exact same lockdown, right? Their borders are going to close, buses can't run, trains can't run. how the hell do you reach Sikkim without buses and trains? So you can also see one is, harder to cope with the lockdown than the other. So this is what we did. So our paper was basically about how a centralized lockdown was not a very good solution for a pandemic in a country like India, where number one, different places were affected at different times and with different severity. And number two, you have vastly different healthcare capacity. Just like if there's a family with 28 kids, they're not all going to end up at IIT, right? So that's basically like the point of our paper.
Thanks, Shruti. So, Himanshu, we have so many different names floating around, from COVID Task Force to COVID War Room to Integrated Command and Control Center, and that's just in Delhi. Some of them are states, some are center. So just tell us a little more about the COVID War Room, when it started, what it does.
Okay. I totally understand the clutter around these task forces because there are so many. And I think this has also led to somewhat a infodemic among the citizens, that which task force does what and what is the mandate of each task force. And over and above that, where I am sitting, that is the war room, what does it do? So I'll deal with these two parts separately. First, I think I'll deal with the war room part. So war room was established around 2 months before I joined the ministry. So I think on 10th of January, WHO gave a docket about coronavirus situation in China to each and every country around the world, and which subsequently led to, in particularly India, there was a internal technical committee meeting, which is known as the Joint Monitoring Group inside the Ministry of Health. So they had a meeting, and India basically floated out the first travel advisory on 17th of January 2020. And around that time, the war room was established. Now, what does the war room do? So its role is evolving one. Earlier, when the lockdown was not there, it was all about tracking the travelers or the citizens who were traveling from abroad, or foreign nationals who were traveling into country. So we have to keep a track of each and every individual who is flowing in and out of the country, and who may have the coronavirus with them. So if you remember, I think the earlier cases were around 14 or 19 Italian tourists who were touring around Rajasthan. And so that was the purpose then of the war room, that you have to keep track of these things, along with NCDC, which is the National Center for Disease Control, which has the mandate of tracking and surveillance under the IDSP program, which is the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program. So it's a joint operation kind of thing. But when the lockdown struck, the war room kind of became a nerve center for the ministry. So what it did eventually was that I think when lockdown was struck, there were around 306 odd cases in the country. But slowly and gradually, when the cases were coming, and the war room defined the parameters on which these things can be given to the officials, so as to take so as to enable them to take a meaningful decision. So we were tracking the growth of cases, deaths. Doubling time is the one indicator which was used profoundly in the early days of lockdown. Then we were also using some tools in order to identify potential hotspots, earlier through data analysis, and later through Arogya Setu and Itihas hotspot technique. Then there is also infrastructure availability module, in which the districts are giving the union government about their infrastructure availability. PPE was an issue in the early days. So all these things were tracked by the war room, and these were also drilled down to the district level. So all these things were being monitored, and whatever the reports, whatever the analysis which we did, it was mainly for the internal consumption of the ministry officials, because it was them. I think they required a kind of day-to-day support. I think hourly support, I can say, because in the early days, the information was coming in an hour's sense. Because when Bhilwara came, then I think next Hola Mohalla in Punjab came. Then it was, I think, the Nizamuddin event in Delhi. Then I think there was some event in Nagpur as well, with respect to some Sikh congregation or some that aspect. So these things were being kept part of, and this role has subsequently changed over the time. So when you had unlock beginning in the month of June, so we were then tracking the unlock part, which districts are going under unlock. So initial categorization of red, orange, green districts in the early days, that which will go under red highest restriction, which will have a relative relaxation. So all these things we were keeping track of, and it went on subsequently, and we are still doing so. When again, after passing the second wave, different states are opening at a different point in time based on their own case trajectory. So we are observing each and everything to the district level. And coming to the second part of your question, I'll just give you a small clarity, or for the audience member, that what are the different task force major ones. So in March 2020, ICMR established the 21-member national task force, which is chaired by the member health Niti Aayog and co-chaired by Secretary Health, as well as Secretary DHR, who is also the DG ICMR. On 29th of March, Ministry of Home Affairs constituted 10 empowered groups, which were dealing with different aspect of COVID responses. These 10 empowered groups were regrouped into 6 on 11th September 2020. These are again regrouped into 10 empowered groups in May 2021. Then in April 2020, PMO constituted a vaccine task force, which looked after different aspects of vaccine development way back from April month. So all the partnership with the private sector. So it is chaired by Dr. V.K. Paul and the principal scientific advisor, Professor Vijay K. Raghavan. In May 2020, there was a national supermodel committee, which basically gives us the prediction that how is the curve behaving inside the country, and they drill it down to the state and the district level based on the quality data availability. So I think presently it is also in the public domain. Website is, I think, sutra.in. So anybody can go and check what is the trajectory which India is following right now. Subsequently, in August 2020, there was a NEGVAC, which is the National Expert Group on Vaccine Administration. Then in December, you had INSACOG for genomic surveillance. INSACOG is basically Indian SARS-CoV Genomic Consortium. So at different point in time, you had different task force which were dealing with different aspects. For someone who is looking this from the outside, I completely agree. It seems like a bit random pixels of an image, but if you look at from a higher point of view, it will all fit in a good image which can make sense for everybody else.
Thanks, Himanshu. Shruti, you did speak about what went wrong with the policy or why things got complicated, but surely there's something that the central government did right. So can you, I mean, if there's one thing that you said, one policy that they got right that helped us, mitigate the pandemic, what would it be?
Okay, so, it's not, okay, I just want to put this out there, okay? This might be a difference between how academics think about things and how whatever the discourse is in India, I don't know what TV channel people are watching, right? When academics say that we got something right or wrong, we're looking at it fairly clinically, okay? We're not literally going and pointing fingers and wanting to say, what the hell did you do wrong? Okay, I just want to put this out there because that changes the nature of the discourse. It doesn't matter who the prime minister is, okay? For 70 years, this has been the way we have run our country. Our centripetal system is there for healthcare, it is there for agriculture, it is there for everything, okay? So if tomorrow you make me the prime minister, I'm going to tell you exactly the same thing about India. This is what we have got wrong. Right now, the specific outcome of COVID, I think the one thing India did get right is that India was not full of COVID deniers. Okay. And this has been a problem globally, right? I mean, just look at Brazil. It took about 8 months or more for their, head of government to wake up and realize that COVID is a thing, right? Trump for a very long time was kind of first, he blamed China and called it the Chinese virus. And then he became full on COVID denier and said, nothing's going to happen. So it's I think India got it right very early in the beginning. They figured out that, hey, this is a virus. It needs to be taken seriously. There needs to be a war room. We should hire Himanshu, which is a good thing, right? We need to think about this properly and have some kind of pandemic management, right? So I think that part India got right. India, to a very large degree, I think also got it right that we need to lock down. Okay. The nature of the lockdown and the purpose of the lockdown is what it got wrong. So if you remember, when India declared the lockdown, we had very little information. Okay. At that point, I mean, Himanshu can correct me here, but we knew the fatality rates in Italy and Spain, right, where the life expectancy is much higher, the comorbidities were much higher. It was an older population, and they literally, I mean, I have studied in Italy. I had friends who were putting up on Facebook and Twitter the obituaries from Bergamo, which is a town. It had 16 pages of obituaries. Okay, this is extraordinary occurrence in the world. Now the Princess cruise ship study came out much later, right? 3 to 4 weeks later, and then we were like, oh, the fatality rates are in the single digits. Actually, it's just about 1%, and that realization came later. So at the time when India imposed the lockdown, given how terrible India's healthcare capacity was, I don't think there was any other choice. Okay, so even the policy of the lockdown, I think, was a good one. I think where it went wrong is because these are not binary yes and no decisions, right? I mean, you can say, yes, the whole country should lock down, but there are 10,000 things that go into exactly how a lockdown should be conducted. I think that is where the Indian government got very ambitious. This is just hubris, it's just like central planning. You think you can actually govern an entire country sitting in Delhi. It cannot be done, right? So the lockdown should have been extremely localized. It should have been very pinpointed, but instead the entire country was shut down. There was no provision made in terms of universal basic income or some kind of provisioning made for the poor, made for the migrants. I mean, these are serious governance questions, right? So that's one. The second part that India got terribly wrong in the lockdown is testing. My understanding, if my memory serves me right, going back to March last year, is there was no question of a vaccine at that time. Right? The none existed. We didn't even know if anything would work. So the only way out of the problem was the South Korean way, which is you hugely ramp up testing capacity. And that's the only real solution you have to returning to some kind of normalcy. This 8 month, 10 months work from home and lockdown and perpetual, we are hiding and wrapping ourselves in bubble wrap. That was never supposed to be the point. But we didn't use the lockdown properly. Right? ICMR was too slow to scale up testing capacity. Both the union government and then, of course, the Supreme Court will screw up everything that the government does in a greater proportion. You're imposing price controls on testing during a pandemic. I mean, any student who's taken Econ 101 will tell you that's a terrible idea, right? You want prices to be extremely flexible so that testing can scale up quickly. So these are some of the mistakes that were made. So it's not like, Indian government got this right and that right. It's like, it's always complicated, Was a lockdown necessary? Probably incredibly so. Should it have been done without some kind of end date or universal basic income? Should a 3-week lockdown have gone down for 71 days? No, right? I mean, we all saw the horror. So that's how I would think about that question.
Thanks, Shruti. So Louis, you've seen the government from a policy sector in the banking sector. So can you sort of just contrast this for what we are hearing about health, just your experience with government policy?
When you look at it, Natasha, the government's sort of a great enabler, and the government can also be a great constrictor. And when I look at policies which have impacted my own personal life, way back in 93, when the government decided that they will allow private sector banks to happen, it created a huge new opportunity by allowing private sector operations in banking, which was at that time predominantly either public sector or foreign banks. And we created this new animal called the private sector bank. It was a policy step about how do you sort of improve banking in the country. And that's led to the banking sector growing significantly, Has it cannibalized parts of other sectors? Of course it has. The larger banks at that time have become smaller and less important than they are today. The second policy measure that impacted my life personally was in 2002, when the finance minister in the budget, Yashwant Sinha, announced the setting up of an infrastructure equity fund. I then went and reached out to Deepak Parekh saying I wanted to do something on the development side, and he said, Louis, why don't you run this fund? And suddenly I found myself as an infrastructure person. Again, basically because of a policy measure taken by the government. So these are sort of ways that have impacted it. So we come back to healthcare. Healthcare, as as Shruti mentioned, and I hope that you guys are enjoying this discussion, because in a way it's really what we're trying to create at ISPP is a sense of inquiry into understanding challenges that are happening here. And that's why, Govind, I want to thank you for sort of suggesting this, and Rati for helping put this all together, and Natasha and Parul, etc., for helping us do this together, because it's important for people to understand why things happen and what's causing these problems. So you look at healthcare. 2 years ago, when people could meet freely, we had a dinner at our place for CCS in Mumbai, and Dr. Jaiprakash Narayan, who started the Lok Satta Party, was there. And he made this comment that every year, 60 million people in India go back into poverty because of costs of healthcare. Now, when you look at the period from 2006 to 2016, India took 271 million people out of poverty. That's a huge number. Now, if you take into account that same period, 60 million people into 10 years, that's 600 million people. Obviously, there's a double count over here, etc. But 600 people sort of gone back into poverty in that period because of healthcare. So if we can fix the healthcare situation in India, I think that's a huge poverty reduction tool for us in the country. It's, and honestly, I didn't understand it myself. So in 2010, when I quit full-time work, I said what a lot of people over here would be saying, I want to work in education. That's the big problem we have. And then Armida Fernandez of Sneha, she reached out to me and said, Louis, will you join our board? And I said, I know nothing about healthcare. And suddenly she explained to me the importance of healthcare in eradicating poverty, in education. If kids, for example, from the age of -9 months to 3 years don't get proper nutrition, whatever you do for them in education is a waste of money because their brain has not been developed enough. So that's the importance of healthcare and nutrition in our country. So how can we do that? So last Sunday, we actually had something which is interesting at ISPP. We had something called the Policy Commons, which are broadcasted webinars featuring someone from Bazaar, Sarkar, and Samaj. And Somit Ghosh, who founded Ujjivan Financial Services, was talking about the need to have a health commission in the country, which operates on a public-private partnership mode. So you have the control, the supply of infrastructure set up by the government, and at times even by the private sector, and you have the joint partnership, which is an important policy way to take the lessons that we've learned from the financial services opening up and the infrastructure opening up into creating better healthcare outcomes for us in the country. The last point I want to say is that India has, in the last sort of 10 years, spending between 1.2 to 1.6% of our GDP on public healthcare. Comparative numbers in the UK is, if I'm not mistaken, 9%, Japan is 10%, US is 16%. How do you expect us to survive? And now, when you put all of that into perspective and look at the low death rates in the country compared to what's happened in other places because of the pandemic and other stuff, you're going to be amazed as to why the deaths are so low in the country. There's something which the government has done also, which is very good, or just the people, or it's the weather, or the thousands of gods we have, or whatever. But given the low spending on healthcare, the fact that only so few people have got it and died is a miracle in a way.
Thank you.
I want to add one thing to what Louis said. Dr. Jaiprakash Narayan might have given these figures, but these are NSS figures that Louis just quoted to you, right? This is National Sample Survey. This is government data, right? And the government data systematically tells you, did you go to a government hospital? Did it not provide sufficiently for you? What made you go to a private hospital? How did you raise the money? Was it family and friends? Did you sell your assets, like literally selling your bangles or selling your home, right? Did you pull your kids out of school? We have very granular survey data on how the poor spend on healthcare and become further impoverished, right? This is not stuff that we're just making stuff up, the 60 million and all. So this is government data. The government's aware of it. It tracks it every 4 years, right? So there is just no question that this, and again, this has been a problem for a long time. Now, one thing I want to add to what Lewis said is the change post 1991, post liberalization, as India and Indians got richer, is that when we say India spends X amount on healthcare, some of it is spent by the government and some of it is spent by the private sector, right? So in India, the private sector spends about 3 times as much as the government. And what do I mean by the private sector? You and me, right? We spend 3 times more. Regular people go to private hospitals and spend money in private clinics relative to every rupee that the government spends, right? So India spends roughly $40 per capita, right, on this. Only $16 of the 40 is spent by the government. Okay,
Thanks.
so this is a very dire situation. It's a miracle we're all alive in the numbers that we are.
Himanshu,
Yep.
back to you. So we've been getting questions on the chat saying, you know, did IISc help? Did this institution help that institution? So kind of just tell us, where do you get your information from in the COVID war room? And how did you know the policy framework to work within? Because it was, again, college to war room.
Okay. So first, answering the information part, I think it's a bit easy for us because there is a centralized COVID portal which exists in the Union Ministry of Health, which captures data from the district level. So states and districts, they themselves fill in the data with respect to their active cases, recovered cases, deaths, testing, availability of COVID treatment facilities, containment zones, logistics, PPE, ventilator, HCQ, testing reasons, everything is filled by the districts. So districts officials, there are designated people who are responsible for these tasks to enter in the centralized COVID-19 portal, which exists from the beginning of War Room itself. So, and the system is designed in such a way that we can do our own analysis on those data sets as well. And as well as the system is equipped to provide the analysis of growth rate, the testing per million, confirmation percentage to the district level. So to just to say that I think today, if I see the numbers, so these numbers are for us readily available. So today, let's say, to put a perspective, the 97 districts today in country have positivity rate more than 10%. 131 districts in country today have a positivity rate between 5 to 10%. So these are the districts which are a cause of worry for us right now. And rest of the districts which have less than 5% positivity rate, which is a not a, I cannot say we can stay relaxed, but these are a little less concerned than the other districts because they still are facing higher positivity rate, because positivity rate is an indicator that how widespread your infection is in the community, because as you test more, you are getting more people, and that's how the function rotates around it. So data part, I think it's pretty sorted for us. With respect to, if you want to just put it down in a perspective, so we have COVID India portal for state, district, facility, logistics data. Then we have something called ICMR portal, which gives you the testing data in a line listing form. And it has also bifurcation in terms of RT-PCR and RAT test. RT-PCR is the gold standard, as I think now all of us might have got used to this terminology. Antigen, RAT is the antigen test. Then you have a COVID portal for the vaccination data, which is now flowing post 16th of January. And then if you want to just check the data at the state or district level, the states in this pandemic has also done good, and they have launched their own dashboards, which are pretty updated. They also issue regular daily bulletins, I think, at this particular time. 6 to 7 p.m. So they regularly issue a bulletin, and they are doing a fairly good job. So sometimes, let's say if there is some emergency in district and they are unable to upload data in the central COVID portal, we can anytime go to the state dashboards or state bulletins to just verify the data. So the data part for us is pretty much sorted in that respect. But we also do analysis of India vis-a-vis the other countries, how the world as a whole performing with respect to India. So I think on the world data, we have pretty good open source websites. So our WHO dashboard is a good one. It gives you data on a regular basis, and it is also trustworthy because the sovereign governments are feeding the data in the WHO dashboard. But then you have also the crowdsourced, you can say, the R world in data, which has become quite synonymous to what is covid19india.org in India. So these are the two good data sets for the global data. But then you have also Worldometer, John Hopkins dashboard, Bloomberg vaccination dashboard. So the data is pretty much available in the public domain, and we gather all these data sets from different sources and try to put out the best information which can be consumed in very quick, you can say, bits and capsules for the officials to see through those numbers and make a decision if uh, the future course of action is to be decided. The second part, the framework, I think I'll take what Shruti said in the beginning, that it is something which is never happened in 100 years for us. So policy framework for this is very difficult to define as such. But for me, I am straight out of ISPP and put it to the ministry. So I do not have, you can say, the prior much work experience in this particular domain. So I have to keep my eyes and ears open in the ministry, because there are people who have handled the previous pandemics like the SARS, MERS, Zika, H1N1, Ebola, Nipah, everything. So there are people in the ministry who have handled these pandemics, and they know what are the frameworks which they used in the earlier epidemics. They were not the pandemics, but they were quite a large disease outbreaks. So there were some existing, you can say, frameworks which were there in ministry. And in addition to this, our training at ISPP also helps us get those tools and skill sets which are universally applicable. So they fall under each and every policy framework you want to apply. But I think I'll take just a cue. So I think in the April, Shruti and Ajay did a podcast on Ideas of India, where it said that Ajay mentioned with respect to free ride on the regulatory capacity of the different countries. So this is something which we are also using in the emergency situation. You have to use this data set. So let's say if you do not, if you're not able to do something with respect to vaccination studies, so you straight away take some studies which have happened in the US or UK in order to make an account while you do your domestic studies. So you have to also take in account those regulatory framework which the advanced nation are already doing, because they have wherewithal, they have the capacity, and these capacities cannot be built overnight in our country. So they will take time. But so it's a mix of these things. So you have a WHO which is a centralized policy framework which gives you some uniform standards which can be applicable to whole country. Then in India specific, you have uh, academic papers, you have podcasts which are also discussing these things. So we being kind of nerve center, we have we find time to listen to these podcasts, read these papers, and try to plug in these gaps if we can, what is feasible in our context. Because sometimes it also a matter of putting the right thing at the right moment, and if it gets absorbed in the system and your system response evolves in that respect. So it's a mixed batch of all these things. So there is no clear cut policy framework, but yeah, it evolves. It constantly evolves all the time. So in lockdown you have a different framework, in unlock you have a different framework. Then on the top of it you have vaccination. Then again, while vaccination is going, the second wave comes in. So it's a dynamic situation. The frameworks are designed with all the multiple stakeholders, so the academics, the WHO, the regulatory agency, the advanced nations, what we read, and what we skill sets we have got. So it's a mix, uh, bunch of all these things taken together.
Thanks, Himanshu. So Shruti, I'm going to come to you with a point that Himanshu made. So you've done the podcast, you've written the research papers. Did you have any contact or feedback from the government? Have you seen any of your suggestions or recommendations implemented because they contacted you, or just as a coincidence, maybe they were thinking the same thing? Because you did write some specific policy measures that the country should implement way back in March or April. So
Yeah. So, we got pretty good feedback on, I did a work with Abhishek Chautakunta in early April, and I think by end April 2021 with Alex Tabarrok. Both of those papers, I think we put them out so early before there was much work on this. They got a fair bit of traction. On the April 2020 paper, we had different state governments, public health officials reach out to us. So I think there were people from Kerala who reached out. There were some people from Northeast who reached out, who literally said, oh, we didn't know this was the condition of our healthcare capacity. Number one, can you share the data with us? Can you tell us how to improve it, and so on? And we gave them pretty common sense advice, frankly. You can very quickly increase hospital beds, right? But you cannot overnight increase the number of doctors and nurses you have. It just can't be done. So you can pull some people out of retirement, and you can requisition private sector clinics and things, but you can't do, it's relatively inelastic supply, right? So we gave them some bits of advice. I think the most important recommendation that went through, and I don't know if this is coincidence or they were really listening, though they did reach out to us, was our suggestion on PPE. Okay, this is the protective equipment. So, Himanshu can tell you a little bit about this. We were at a stage where testing kits and PPE had to be approved, right? So testing kits needed to be approved by ICMR, and PPE kits needed to be approved by different government agencies before you can say this can be used in India, right? And this is where a conversation that I've had with Ajay or a previous framework from another space comes in very handy, because we're like, hey, there are these countries using all these. We know these work. Why do you need to go back and reinvent the wheel and waste your state capacity and delay, right? So that was one. The second was we had recommended waiving custom duty and IGST and GST on testing kits and PPE equipment that came in from abroad, right? And remember, again, this is March, April 2020. We are not producing enough, right? And we can't produce enough and scale up production until ICMR can approve more different kinds of testing kits. So, it keeps getting circular, right? And this was also a point when tens of thousands of testing kits were sitting in customs, because the NGOs and the governments, friendly governments who had sent them, did not think that they would need to pay custom duty for this. So there are some, weird kinks like this in the system. So at that time, I think the finance minister had announced that until September 2020, all, on PPE equipment and testing kits, import duties and IGST and things like that will be waived. I think those kinds of things went through. A recommendation that I made in September, which I think might have been the most prescient thing I have ever said, and I don't think you never get policy predictions right, so this is a total dumb luck, right? Was we need to vaccinate, right? And that at that time I had suggested having a advanced purchase commitment of about 500 million doses. This was in September last year. And at that point, there was a lot of complacency, and, we have won the war against COVID, and, Indians have hardly died, the whole narrative, right? But at the same time, people like Himanshu, those who are studying the virus, understand that it is the unvaccinated populations where there's the greatest threat of new mutations of the virus, right? So it's not that, the alpha variant we might have conquered, but the longer the population stay unvaccinated, the more new mutations and variants come out. And we know, we've experienced firsthand the Delta variant, which is the, B1617. It's just wreaked havoc across India, right? And that is a direct consequence of an unvaccinated population. So I think the way forward is just vaccinate. And the way to vaccinate is throw money at the problem. Right? It is the cheaper alternative to spend about 1 to 1.5% of your GDP and spend the money and pay the private sector to help you vaccinate, rather than lose 8 to 10% of your GDP in lockdowns and other horrible measures where people both get infected and they're dying of poverty, right? So, I mean, unemployment went up during the first lockdown by about 24%, right? Growth rates plummeted by about 11%. So the vaccination, costly as it may be, is actually the cheapest and the smartest way out. This is not just true for India, this is true for every country. At this point, about 13% Indians have had one dose, about 3.5% Indians are fully vaccinated, have had both doses, right? The Delta variant is much more ineffective against people who have been double vaccinated than those with only one shot, unlike the Alpha variant, right? Which was, the second shot was the cherry on top, that there wasn't that much difference. So this is something we really need to keep in mind, right? We got to vaccinate the largest number of people as quickly as possible and just spend a lot of money doing it. We can afford it.
Thanks, Shruti.
Natasha, I just want to jump in because a question was asked earlier. But should the government also have consultations with civil society, corporates, etc.? No, we're in a crisis, we're in an emergency. And therefore, decisions have to be taken fast. So some decisions will not work out, some will be involving more spending, etc. But as Shruti mentioned, that you have to sort of just go ahead and start locking in and into orders, maybe spending more. Like, I was having this conversation with Govind. This whole issue of oxygen came about, shortage of oxygen. Now, clearly, some of the places where we were supplying oxygen will not require it, or it'll be wasted. But there is still a larger need across the country. So I think there's another question which is asked about, what about the rural places versus the cities, etc. Of course, there is a need in the smaller towns over there for it. Some of them will, like in some of the places I know of, they required oxygen, and now the problem is over, and they've got all that facilities over there. But maybe if there's a third wave, it will be used then. It could be used for something else. So as long as that infrastructure is not wasted, it's still a viable sort of investment to be made. And that's the sort of lessons which we're talking to Himanshu about. That it's difficult in hindsight for us to criticize a lot of things because you're taking decisions in real time, especially last year when you didn't know what was happening, or when the second wave was happening, what to do. And some decisions won't work out well, but the point is to keep taking decisions and moving forward.
So, Himanshu, there are questions on the chat about the third wave, etc. And as Louis commented, everyone's wondering, for most of us, there was a lull between the first and the second wave. What's it been like at the war room, at the start, in the middle, now? Because we really can't say it's over.
So Himanshu, by the way, have you noticed everyone's excited about this war room that you're working in, okay?
So I think it's a good question. But for us, I can straight away say there was never a lull. There was never a lull because our cases started increasing in the month of July as soon as we started the unlock. And we peaked around 17th of September with 97,000 cases. But the point is that the different states peaked at a different time.
Different points. Yeah.
So for us, there was never a lull. So to put things into perspective, so in August and September, the top 5 contributing states were Maharashtra, Andhra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Uttar Pradesh. In November, it was Delhi, Kerala, Maharashtra, West Bengal, and Rajasthan. So you have 4 states completely replacing the other 4. In January, they again changed. It was Kerala, Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. So the Karnataka and the Tamil Nadu are making a reappearance. In March, they again changed to Kerala, Punjab, Karnataka, Gujarat. So at every point in time, there were different states who were going in a different, you can say, stage of pandemic. And as I said earlier, that we were managing things at a district level also. So at every point, we were never in a condition where we can say that, let's say, our districts in some or all the districts in a particular states are COVID free. There was never a case. And COVID has, I think, taught us that none of us are safe if everyone is safe. So the thing was same for India. So for us, the states keep on changing so Maharashtra was a constant, but the other 4 were constantly changing for us from August, September, November, January, March. So let's say in the last month, it was again the 4 southern states of Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and Maharashtra. But 2 months back, it was not the case. because Andhra and Tamil Nadu started peaking at the later time. So they then remain a cause of concern for us. And and I think the lull is also a relative phenomena. uh, and I think it has to do with something habituation effect, because right now we are at a level when we were panicking in the last year. So we got used to the 4 lakh level. The 60 or 70,000 is seeming normal to us. But in the last wave, we were panicking about this number. I think a week back, we crossed our first peak number. Only a week back, we crossed the 1 lakh mark. So in the previous wave, we didn't hit the 1 lakh mark, but now the 1 lakh is a lull for us. But for us in the war room, it is not a lull, because 1 lakh is still a significant number, and the virus is unpredictable, so to say, and it can anytime turn around and hit you back. We don't know. So we have to keep vigil at all times, and therefore you have to keep building the awareness about the fact that keep your masks up. That is the only solution for now, until the country is vaccinated. So that is the most feasible solution which we are seeing, and you cannot be complacent in this matter. So for the majority of people, it may be lull, but for us, it is not.
Okay, thanks so much. Shruti, back to you. What role did policy? So we saw a tremendous difference of response between states and between the same state response in the first and second wave. But what role did policy, and of course, as you explained, there is finance and infrastructure and legacy issues that are the major contributing factor. But are there any state-to-state policy issues that have compounded the situation?
Yes, I mean, so, I want to separate two parts of the crisis. One part of the crisis is medical, right? There is a virus that is out there that we didn't fully understand, and it's highly transmissible, and there's only so much we can do. And we can evolve as we go along. As Himanshu said first, they said any cloth you can cover your face with, and then we know you need a mask, and then we know you really need an N95 mask. And, so that evolves. That knowledge evolves. The protocol on how to treat someone with COVID evolves. Now we know steroids is not the best idea, so on and so forth. But the second part of the problem is that there is a political economy problem, right? And that also needs to be resolved. Now, the biomedical aspect of vaccines was resolved last year in February, over one weekend, when researchers across the globe got together and they sequenced the mRNA vaccine, and we had a vaccine, right? Now, why don't we have a vaccine today? When we had a functional vaccine a year ago and we had clinical trials all of last year, why don't we have a vaccine today? That is not a biomedical or a technical problem. That is a political economy screw up, okay? They have fundamentally misunderstood demand and supply. If they had asked Himanshu, Himanshu would have told you, I have learned from economists at ISPP that the supply curve slopes upwards, right? So if we make large purchase orders at a sensible price, the supply will be forthcoming, right? If the rest of the world, the vaccine demand goes from 4 billion to 14 billion in a matter of 1 year, then you're going to have shortages of tubes. You're going to have shortages of filters. You're going to have shortages of all the ingredients. What happens when there's a shortage? You need to pay more money to attract those ingredients to you versus going to someone else, right? Now, this does not need a doctor. This does not need a prime minister. Okay, this does not need anyone except someone with functional economics knowledge. Now, linking this back to a previous conversation, do we need more people to consult on policy questions? Do we need civil society participate? All that is fine. But we first need to understand the nature of the problem we're solving, right? If I need to know whether a bridge will stand, I will get you a civil engineer who will run stress tests, okay? If I need to know if the cement will show up on time, I will call an economist. They are fundamentally different problems, right? Every single time, the entire mess that has been made in India has been economic. Okay, that's the only role I have to play in this. That's why I keep pointing out the messes. Someone thinks that I have like a partisan problem, or I hate the, Maharashtra, or I hate the Union Ministry of India or whatever. No, it's not true. It's just Economists are able to see the mess that was created because we did not solve the economic problem appropriately. We did not start with budgeting for it properly. We imposed all kinds of stupid taxes on it. We didn't allow supply to be forthcoming and adjust as quickly as people were demanding, whether it was masks, PPE kits, or vaccines. All these are economic disasters. That's the problem. Okay. So now Himanshu, when he comes in, he doesn't have any great specialized knowledge on COVID because no one could have had it. When he started, nobody knew about COVID. What does he bring to the table? He knows how to read data, right? So when he says, I'm looking at the COVID data portal, I'm looking at the COVID portal, he knows how to read and understand data. He knows what an exponential graph looks like. He knows that today, if only 16 people are affected and the doubling rate is every 3 days, he knows he has a huge problem 3 weeks from today, right? So this is the technical. So the technical knowledge that needs to come in is someone who understands growth rates, someone who understands compound interest, someone who understands demand and supply curve, someone who understands pricing. That's the framework with which you need to pursue this. Same thing can be said for vaccines. Same thing can be said for the third wave of, whatever is going to happen next. Same thing is going to be said for how we should have transportation. Should we allow Ubers? Should we have schools open? These are all cost benefit questions, right? So you need someone with the appropriate level of economic training to be the right people who are involved with others who make the decisions. I want to put that out there right now. So if you start making a laundry list of everything the government got right, they were all the technical problems they got right. If you make a laundry list of everything the government got wrong, it is all the economic questions that they got wrong, right? So you need better economists in the government. That's it. That's the answer to the problem. So you hire Ajay Shah or you hire Himanshu, right? Now we're talking. Okay, you hire Vijay Kelkar. There's no one who knows more than Vijay Kelkar about fiscal federalism. He's written the book on fiscal federalism, right? So you hire the right people to do the job. They will tell you it's not partisan. It's not, are you free market versus something else? You hire a sensible economist who understands that vaccine is a public good, whereas a hospital bed is a private rival good, right? Every person who gets vaccinated protects themselves and protects everyone around them. Every person who occupies a private hospital bed or a government hospital bed prevents anyone else from, using that private hospital bed. We call that rival versus non-rival consumption, right? So this is just something you need to understand to solve even the most basic. Now you can use that for, plastic bags. You can use that for vaccines. You can use that for a pandemic. You can use that on how to distribute toilets. But it's the same problem over and over and over again. How is it in the United States? Someone keeps asking me, well, we need good economists everywhere. Okay, so it's probably the same. But in the US, there was something called the Operation Warp Speed that took place, right? This happened under the Trump administration. The people who were involved in it are people like Nobel laureate Michael Kramer, right? Who literally wrote the manual on advanced purchase commitments on vaccines, right? Alex Tabarrok, my co-author, and both Himanshu and my teacher was also on the Operation Warp Speed team. Now, what does that team tell you? They basically said, look, we don't know which vaccine is going to work. Okay, we know 10 of them are right now in clinical trials. This is, June last year, July last year. So we don't know which one is going to work. So at this point, let's throw money at the problem and buy purchase commitments for all 12 of them. So people are talking about how in the US right now, the US is sitting on a stockpile of vaccines and, they're hoarding and all that. Actually, they're not. They just got lucky because every single vaccine purchase order commitment they made ended up passing the clinical trial. They didn't know, is AstraZeneca going to work? Is Pfizer going to work? Is Moderna going to work? So you buy 300 million of all three, right? Now you have 600 million left over. That's what's going on in the US, right? Now that is a solution. Remember, Operation Warp Speed is an economic victory, right? Moderna sequencing the vaccine over a weekend, that is a biomedical scientific victory, right? We've had the scientific victory equally applicable to the whole world, but there's only one country which has excess supply right now, which is the United States. That is only thanks to economists, right? So I don't want to keep overstating the importance of my profession, but unfortunately, a lot of the screw ups which are taking place the world over in the pandemic seem to be the misunderstanding of the economic nature of the problem, which is buried 3 layers after the technical problem or the scientific problem.
Thanks, Shruti. Himanshu,
Yeah.
I've been warned that there's more things you can't talk about than things that you can. But if you can please share with us one thing of import that is in the public domain, but probably most of us wouldn't know about.
Okay. I'll take the cue from what Shruti said regarding the PPE. So I don't know whether many people know about this or not, but till mid-March 2020, India had no indigenous capability for manufacturing PPE coverall, which is required for the pandemic, you can say, or in the hospital settings. We do manufacture some PPE which are required in the industrial setup, but we did not have single manufacturer in the country who would manufacture the PPE which were required for the hospital settings. And on the eve, I think, of lockdown, India launched a Operation PPE Coverall, and in 60 days, India became the second largest PPE producer in the world. In 60 days, I think in mid-May we were producing around 4.5 lakh PPE kits per day, and now the capacity is around 10 lakh PPE kits per day. So that is why I think most of us in the March or starting of the April, when people were raising concern about the PPE shortage, which is going to come when the COVID will spread, actually didn't happen, because there was something which was working at the back, the Operation PPE Coverall. And there is a very good report about this as well. I'll share the link in the chat box as well for everyone to see that how actually India got everything right for the PPE mission per se, that the regulator, the tester, and the Ministry of Textiles, how they put officials at the manufacturing site in order to expedite the approvals, and how the manufacturers were helped in order to fill the regulatory process, so as to they do not have to wait for the red tapeism, but the kind of file went to them. So it's a very good case study in that respect. And I think the last thing would be that it is also a good dramatic turn when we engaged our domestic textile manufacturers to PPE manufacturers. So when lockdown struck, they were kind of, you can say, jobless is a wrong word, but they were out of business. So they were repurposed to manufacture the PPE, and with the help of government, private sector, it's a joint operation of sorts, in which I think India emerged victorious on that front, PPE particularly.
Thank you, Himanshu. So as we're nearing the end, I'm going to put in a couple of audience questions and try and club them together for all of you. So mute them. So I know there are people in the audience as well who are working either individually or through different government task forces. What role can civil society organizations or individuals, either individually or using a private government public partnership, what can we do to either influence policy or help sort of mitigate some of the effects that we are facing from the pandemic?
If I can start with that, I think we need to think very long term and build very long pipelines. Okay. You can't produce Himanshu overnight, just like you can't produce a doctor overnight. Okay. To have someone like Himanshu at the right place at the right time in the right war room requires years and years of investment. It requires an excellent public policy school. It requires an excellent technical school before that, right? It requires a certain kind of nurturing of talent. Now, the trouble is, we tend to think that when the crisis strikes, magically people will be available and the talent will be available to solve the crisis. That's one problem. Now, let's say in a country of 1.5 billion, the talent is available. The networks may not be available to get the right person to the right place, right? So there are two things that are happening, right? To get Himanshu to the war room, not only does he need to exist and he needs to be nurtured and his capabilities need to be built up. But he also needs the network of ISPP, which sends him the email at the fortuitous moment that says, hey, we need someone like you in the war room. Are you interested? Right? Now, these pipelines take forever to build. And we are somehow in India, because there are so many urgent problems, no one is interested in building those pipelines. That's really what's going on, right? Now, ISPP, Lewis will tell you what a nightmare it is to get a school. I mean, any institution. It is difficult to get a poker club started and sustained, okay, week after week. To start an institution, whether it is an NGO, whether it is an informal network, whether it is SPP, whether it is ISPP, just takes such a long time to keep it going, right? We've had maybe a month's worth of planning for this one conversation, right? You want to do this on a sustained basis, you know what it takes. That's what we need, okay, at the very least. We need to have a pipeline of talent, network, and infrastructure that is capable of solving problems in large teams, collaborating really well at the opportune moment, but all that infrastructure needs to be ready. For that, you need people who are very, very far-sighted, who are willing to build institutions that will take 20, 30, 40 years. It takes 100 years to build some institutions, and then you're getting somewhere. So we need farsightedness and the commitment to that, right? Thankfully, the people in this room get that. That's why we're in the room. But that's very difficult in India, where, you know, people are dying outside and people are starving, and there's so many urgent concerns that demand your money and your time, right? I mean, you could spend the same 3,000 rupees, instead of donating it to a good school, you can spend it and someone will get their medical treatment tomorrow or get their cataract surgery tomorrow, and you feel, oh my God, that is such a immediate impact, right? That we can save someone's life, we can save someone's eyesight. But we need people who are very, very far-sighted.
Lewis, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so as you know, Shruti talked about the long-term planning that's required, and that's very important. And then you also have the short-term reaction now that there is a crisis. What do we do? And here I can think of people like Sudhir Shenoy, for example, who I've never met, and he does all this fabulous stuff. Gets engaged in fixing a COVID facility. I got involved with him in supplying sort of oxygen cylinders to Chhattisgarh. So all of us getting involved in this, Give India raising money to supply food to people, supply oxygen. We all need to do that. And so there is a long-term reaction. And as Shruti said, to be able to sort of have the facility of setting up a war room so efficiently, and other states have done it, like you know what Maharashtra, for example, has done. And our BMC commissioner over here has done a fabulous job. So that's the long-term sort of effect. And then there's a short-term thing, which we all need to sort of jump in over here and not get worried about, is this the most efficient way to do it? Is it the best way to do it? No, there is an emergency. We cannot figure out the most efficient way in an emergency. People need to get it. Does it make sense to supply oxygen, 20-bed hospital in sort of 200 kilometers away outside Maharashtra, outside Mumbai? Will it be long-term needed? Who knows? But today people are dying over there. Let's get it out there.
Okay. Himanshu, would you?
My take is very small on this, that people often think that they want to contribute in whatever they want, they can. But the issue basically lies at the bottom, is that we want to jump in only when things get serious. So as soon as the thing, let's say the second wave is over, now nobody would be talking about the PSA plants in those hospitals. So it is something like opportunism, but I do not want to put that strong word, but it falls into that category, that we want to give our suggestions because we think we have the best idea at that moment, at the peak, because that will fix the problem, or we'll have all the solutions. But it does not work that way, because it takes time to understand the system. It takes time to align your response in the system, and it will respond, because the political system or the bureaucratic system are not designed, or I think they are not in a manner fashioned to give out knee-jerk reactions in such you can say pandemic like situation. So everything flows through a particular process. You can engage, But to think that my solution would be implemented is too far-fetched.
Govind, you wanted to add something? You're on mute.
Yeah, I know it's coming to the end of the session, Natasha. Thank you. But I wanted to just say it's been a fascinating session for me to just understand different perspectives and learning from others. And I wanted to just share one perspective that there's a lot of execution happening on the ground, Himanshu, and I agree with you that people responded during the crisis. But I can say over the next 60 days, we'll have at least 500 hospitals that I'm aware of in the country that are going to have better infrastructure than they did pre-COVID. And this is not Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore. This is going to be the small. And I'm personally involved with at least a third of them. So I think while the country has responded very favorably, the world has responded favorably to India as well. There have been phenomenal number of people who've contributed. And I think that's really the transformation that's going to happen in India in the next 12 months. So no COVID wave 3 happening, that's great, but the country will get better. And I do want to make that point out there because execution has happened on the ground. And it's been a phenomenal journey for me to observe as somebody who's doing a lot of work in philanthropy. So I just want to make that point to the group out here.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a lot of people who've raised this question. I don't know whether it's really a policy issue, but I am going to put it to you all. It's about vaccine hesitancy. Why is there vaccine hesitancy? What do we do to combat vaccine hesitancy as a policy? Is there something we can do as civil society? What do we do? So just to put it out there, if anyone would like to answer that question, please raise your hand. But otherwise, to our panelists first.
Sure, I want to, but I just want to, before getting there, I just want to take up Govind's point. He talks about 500 hospitals with fabulous infrastructure. The main infrastructure problem we have in the country, and I've been doing this for 20 years, is build, neglect, rebuild. So the question is, what happens after this thing gets over? We will ignore it because you're not provided for maintenance money. So let's make sure that we sort of make sure that when the next problem happens, that machinery is still working. So come back to vaccine hesitancy. I've been working with people I know closely, educated, uneducated, poor, rich, all over across, who sometimes are very hesitant about vaccines. It's not been tested. It's not, God is look after me. All these questions. People have died. I have cousins dying, but they believe that they should be vaccinated. I think what Iqbal Singh Chahal recently in an interview said, they started working with the godmen, the religious people, getting them to tell people, put aside religious beliefs. This is required for you. Secondly, get people of influence to come and talk. Get people, out in public, all the film stars and cricketers that are getting vaccinated. Let people see them getting vaccinated. That gets over the fear that people will have. Anyone else?
I actually have a different perspective on this. I don't think we need to solve vaccine hesitancy. I'll tell you why. It is not the relevant constraint right now. Okay, it's not that we have so much vaccine stockpile कि जिन को चाहिए था उनका vaccination हो गया है and अब ये पड़े बेकार जा रहे हैं. That's not the situation we're in India right now, right? By the time we vaccinate those who are not hesitant, I feel like those who are hesitant will get over it because they will have enough, first person evidence that the people around them who got vaccinated are doing totally fine. And the people around them who aren't vaccinated are getting sick. Okay. This happens over and over again. So I actually don't think we need to really solve for vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy is a problem to be solved in the US right now, where you have so much stockpile and you have about 6 or 7 states which have less than 40%, less than 35% of the people vaccinated, even though the supply exists. In India, vaccine hesitancy is what, 5 to 6%? It'll disappear. I mean, if we ever get to the stage in India where the vaccine hesitancy is a binding constraint, I would personally pop open champagne that day. Okay? Because that means over 90% of the people have been vaccinated already. And the people who are not yet vaccinated don't wish to be vaccinated. And that's fine. You don't need 100% of any population to be vaccinated. So on vaccine hesitancy, I would strongly recommend looking at the problems in the US is elite imitation. Don't do it. It is not a binding constraint in India at all. In India, people who want vaccines are waiting 10 days in line to get it and are, every 5 minutes refreshing COVID. That's the problem you need to solve. Okay.
Thanks.
I'll put out only 3 points in this regard. I think Govind earlier mentioned about the infrastructure. I think PHC also is an infrastructure which exists, but they are defunct. So it's not about the creating infrastructure part, but it is also about manning them and maintaining them well, as Louis pointed out. So infrastructure is one part of it, but we have to go beyond that also. Second, vaccine hesitancy, I think it is not something new. It has been throughout, you can say, ages since vaccine has been there. And third point is, my take is that India is not a vaccine hesitant country in that regard. We have, as in, I think at one point we did have a survey, and around more than 75% of Indians are willing to take vaccines, and the rest of them will automatically follow as soon as the rest of the people are vaccinated. And I think polio vaccines has done a very good job in this regard by rooting the vaccines in the psyche of Indian people, that vaccines are not such a bad thing. It prevents the eventual disease. So vaccine hesitancy for me, I think it is really a very first world problem.
We have gone way beyond time, and thank you all for staying on. I still have one question for those who want to stay on beyond, but I just wanted to say thank you, Shruti, Himanshu, Louis especially, for putting this together with SPP and ISPP. Thank you so much for your time. As Shruti mentioned, we had a discussions for a month, so thank you for the time, not just today, but previously as well. And I'm just going to pose this last question for anyone who wants to stick on and listen, because we've had it through the audience. What are the 3 takeaways that we need to focus on for healthcare? Let's say for the medium term. So we're talking 3 to 5 years. Can I get one from each of you? Shruti, Louis, Himanshu.
Oh, in that order? Okay. I think the one takeaway is massive public investment in healthcare, right? And the realization that it all needs to go together. You can have a pop-up quarantine center overnight. You can have a pop-up hospital center overnight, but you can't build ventilators overnight. That takes time, right? And you certainly cannot build doctors overnight. That takes 25 years, right? So this is an understanding we need to have. So the supply constraint is so visible in healthcare. We need everything. We need more companies that are licensed to produce everything from PPE to ventilators. We need more medical colleges in India that take in higher intake, because we need more doctors. We need more nurses. We need more ASHA workers. We need better electricity, because without it, the ventilator machine cannot be turned on, right? We need the maintenance budgeting to be done, so that when you create a nice clinic in rural areas, it doesn't go into disrepair. All this just requires massive commitment to healthcare. Okay. Just to put this in perspective, if we spend less than 1% of the GDP on healthcare, and we spend about 2.6% on agricultural subsidy, okay, this needs to be there in people's minds. We spend more money on PDS and MSP and fertilizer subsidy and phosphate than we do on healthcare. Okay, it's a huge public health nightmare that we have.
Thanks.
The second part of that is more on public sanitation, right? I mean, the two go hand in hand. You need fewer people falling sick also, and that requires better local governance, better garbage pickup, closing of sewers. I mean, these are things that are really basic, but you can't take them for granted in India. So, I mean, you can have one COVID epidemic, but there's a malaria and dengue epidemic every year that's happening in India, because we don't have decent public sanitation.
Himanshu?
Shruti got on mute, I think, accidentally.
Go ahead, Himanshu.
Okay. I think more or less all the points have been covered by Shruti, but I was recently reading a report on comprehensive nutritional survey, and from that I could gather is food is one of the most significant part with respect to our healthcare. We have to focus on preventive healthcare, and food is just a big part of it. So you have to have a good lifestyle if you don't want to fall sick or the subsequent follow-up, everything. So it's in our hands what we can do. We don't want to rely on the government. So what we can do is we have a very good lifestyle. and the food is a very basic part of it. So I'll to highlight why that is important. So the survey which I was reading, it said that I think 1 in 10 students, that is from 5 to 19, are in pre-diabetic condition. So we are seeing the future non-communicable disease burden which is going to come in next 20 years to us. So we have to catch them young. We have to put emphasis on good nutrition and good lifestyle. It cannot be ignored. It cannot be ignored in simple terms. Rest,
Thank
I think what Shruti has already said.
Louis, something.
Yeah. So that makes it difficult when you've talked about the entire investment, you've talked about the nutrition part. So I guess they'll throw in environment, the quality of the air, the quality of the water, the quality of the soil. That's an important part. But when you look at all of this, it just shows that it's all to do with, it comes down to economics again, and how do you make sure that investment happens and that maintenance of it all takes place. Thank you for this opportunity, this platform to talk about it. When you first suggested it, I immediately thought about Himanshu because he's in the war room and he's really been at the center of it. And Shruti, because Shruti, the only course that I've attended at ISPP is the course that she taught on the Constitution. And when she talked about fiscal federalism and the challenges of that, and the challenges on the healthcare side because of it, I immediately thought of her when you guys brought up the topic on let's discuss the pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for so many questions. And I'm sorry that we've run out of time. I know there are a lot of questions we've been unable to take. We've posted Shruti's papers in the chat, and maybe some of your questions can be answered from there. Otherwise, please feel free to email us and we'll try to take it forward. Thank you so much,
Thanks
everybody.
so much, Natasha.
Thank
I'll just
you.
say one thing. Thanks for having me, Louis. Thanks for inviting me. And any professor will tell you that their greatest joy is to be outshined by their student. So I'm really thrilled with everything that Himanshu is doing.
Thank you. And Natasha, one more thing is, based on the discussion we've had today, if there's anyone who wants to recruit someone like the Himanshu from the current batch, we have a list of profiles of our students, which I guess Natasha, you'll sort of hand out, and also some information about the course we're doing. So if there's anyone interested in joining ISPP, or someone who could be interested, Natasha and Parul and the team will sort of send out some information.
Please reach out.
Yes, we will. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.